Today, The Update is joined by Sir Vince Cable. Vince Cable is a British politician who is the current leader of the Liberal Democrat Party. Prior to this posting, Cable had been Secretary for State Business, Innovation and Skills during the Hung Parliament. After stepping back from politics in 2015, Cable returned to the game in April of this year, becoming party leader in July. The Liberal Democrats are the centre to centre-left party in Britain and are often referred to as the third party of UK politics. Thank you for joining us, Sir Vince. I was just wondering, what is the role of the third party in UK politics?
Well, we don't know what will happen in our very unstable, volatile political situation, but I basically see our role in the immediate future as offering an alternative when the Labour Party has gone off to the extreme left and the Conservative Party has gone off to an extreme Brexit, English nationalist kind of view of the world. I think an awful lot of British people want something else, which is more moderate and commonsensical and less extreme.
If this is the case, then how can you justify the turnout for the Liberal Democrats in the snap election this year? If they were the only party that was publicly supporting the Remain campaign at the time of the election, then where did the 48% of the votes go? Why weren't they towards the Liberal Democrats?
It was a very poor result, and there were several reasons for it. The leader effectively disappeared from the media because of some argument about his views on homosexuality. It was rather unfortunate. He apologised and he stood down. But the deeper reason, I think, was that we just had the referendum. Most of the Remain voters took the view that, well, we'll just get on with the Brexit negotiations and see what happens. I think the mood will change in a year's time when people are confronted with the results, and they will say, well, actually, in many cases, this is so bad, we'd rather go back and be members of the European Union. I think that's what will happen. In that case, being the only anti-Brexit party, exit from Brexit party, I think we will recover our credibility on that issue. But I think the other factor is that a lot of people misunderstand what's happening in the Labour Party. They voted for Jeremy Corbyn, not expecting them to win, not thinking very much about it. But I think if they confront the possibility that they might be the government, I suspect there's a lot of the support will wither away.
Then what's your reaction to what Nick Clegg said the other day about how people who want to remain in the EU should vote for Labour?
I don't think that's what he said. I was with people who were at that meeting and would claim that's not what he said at all. Well, a lot of people did take that view, and there are individual Labour MPs who are Remainers, but their position is a very uncomfortable one.
Regarding Tim Farron and his obviously stepping down from the post of leader of the party, what is your view on faith in politics?
Well, I have no problem with people having personal faith. I mean, we're a free society, and I respect religion. But I think when we come to policy issues, then I think it's important that faith politicians should act in the wider interests of the country and the public that they represent. They can, if they find this is an impossible conflict with their own personal views, they can abstain from the issue. But you know, there is a long tradition in the UK of people putting their own personal faith into one side, but and recognising that society is in a different place.
What would you say to the voters then who are of faith in terms of voting for your party or others?
Well, a lot of people who vote for me are convinced Christians, or for that matter Muslims, and I respect their views. I mean, as it happens, I go to church periodically. I'm not a very devout person, but I do respect religion. I don't think that it shouldn't affect people's voting choices in the way that has emerged here.
Then, regarding climate change at the moment, how do you think that we can reverse climate change now? Do you think that there's a possibility with Trump being so in the belief that it's a myth? What do you think the...
Well, there are a lot of climate change deniers around, and mainly in the United States, but we're also getting them in the UK. And it is making it very difficult to build up a strong political momentum behind some of the difficult choices that you've got to make if you're trying to get carbon emissions down, because it involves, for example, making carbon fuels more expensive. It involves investing quite heavily in new technologies which have to be supported in the short run, and somebody's got to pay for it. So climate change denial is deeply unhelpful, and sadly it's making it much more difficult to build up international agreement. But I think on the positive side, some of the countries which hitherto took no interest in this problem, and I think China was a good example, now take it very seriously and are making a very big commitment to renewable technology.
So then going back to Brexit and sort of all that you said about that, how do you think we could realistically reverse it? How do you think it would actually happen?
Well, I think Brexit probably will happen, but it could be stopped for one of several reasons. It could be that the government's negotiations just collapse and they look for a way out. It could be that we negotiate a transition arrangement, a long-term transition, which effectively is no different from membership, whatever people call it. Or it could be that people accept our argument, the Liberal Democrats' argument, that at the end of the negotiating process, the public should have a choice as to whether to continue with the agreement that the government's achieved, if it does achieve one, or should have an exit from Brexit. So there are various scenarios. I think it's likely Brexit will go ahead, but I think it could be stopped.
In terms of your party, when the next election will come, obviously, would you be interested in having a coalition with either of the parties as they stand at the moment?
Well, we're not looking for a coalition arrangement. Our experience of coalition before is that it's good for the country but not good for the party. You know, we want to be constructive. We're not there just to make life difficult for other parties. But there are different ways of working in Parliament short of coalition. And if we do find ourselves in a hung Parliament situation, then I think we would want to cooperate issue by issue in a pragmatic way. I think coalition is unlikely.
Yeah. In regards to the last coalition under Clegg, one of the big things that came out of that was tuition fees obviously not being taken away. How do you think the government's going to react to that in the future? Do you think that there's any chance that tuition fees will be abolished?
No, absolutely none. And the reason for that is that the coalition didn't introduce tuition fees. They were introduced by the Labour Party when they were in government. They realised universities were going bankrupt, they needed money, and it was not unreasonable to ask. Students don't pay for tuition, they pay when they graduate, depending on their income. So they introduced the system, they then increased it, and then the coalition increased it again. The Liberal Democrats foolishly made a pledge not to, and were caught out having publicly broken a pledge, but that was 7 years ago. But nobody now realistically thinks that universities can be funded without a contribution from the graduates.
Of course. Linking that to Brexit at the moment, one of the big problems for a lot of the students here is that there's a worry that with Britain leaving the EU, that we'll end up having to pay international student fees. What do you think that's looking like for a student?
Well, if Brexit happens, then it is certainly the case that French or German or Dutch students who currently come and pay British fees will be charged the same fees as if they were from China and India. I mean, that is the way it will happen. And universities are very alarmed about that.
And what about the people who actually are British who have come abroad? What do you think the position is going to look like for them?
Well, it depends on, I mean, this is one of the big uncertainties, is what the rights of European Union nationals will be in the UK and British nationals who live in Europe. I think at the moment, under the regulations, you're allowed to be away from the country for a couple of years or something of that kind before being treated as an overseas student in fee terms. But it's one of the big uncertainties that Brexit's been thrown up, and none of us yet have an answer.
So in terms of the voting system and thinking about the sort of the younger population who are voting, the 18 to 25s obviously were largely voting for Remain in the referendum. What do you think their effect was on the overall vote?
Well, if more of them had turned out, the vote may have gone the other way. But it's clear that there is a big age issue. That particular age cohort was strongly Remain. I think it was 80% Remain amongst young women, for example. And I would imagine that 16 to 18-year-olds took a similar view. They weren't allowed to vote. And so it was a vote perpetrated largely by older people at the expense of younger people who will have to pay the consequences. And I think this is one of the factors that's fueling a generational, I wouldn't say conflict, but fundamental, inequality between generations.
So do you think that it was, do you think that the 16 to 18-year-olds should have been able to vote as they were sort of in
Yes,
Scottish?
I'm strongly, quite apart from referendums, I think 16 to 18 should have a vote. And all the evidence we have from Scotland and elsewhere is that they use their votes in a very mature way, and it is their future. No, I'm all in favour of it.
Fab. And then one more question about voting systems. Do you think that if the strictly voting system were a bit fairer, you might have won the Christmas special?
Well, it was done by the judges rather than the public, as far as I remember.
Yeah.
Yes, I was but I think the voting system generally, for strictly, I worry about it because you get all kind of prejudices creeping in, and sometimes very good dancers are voted off. I've got more confidence in the judges than I do with the public, to be frank.
Who do you think is going to win this year?
It hasn't yet emerged. There are about 3 or 4. There's the young man who, the very young guy who said he'd never danced before but looks like a professional dancer. So I haven't got his name, but absolutely brilliant. There's about 3 or 4 of them who can really dance, and it'll be some weeks before the poor ones gradually kicked off.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay.